Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest edition of CEVA Talks. My name's James Baker. I'm the containers editor of Lloyd's List. It's a pleasure to be your host this afternoon, this evening, this morning, wherever you happen to be. Just a bit of background. This is CEVA Talks is a series of live discussions with leading experts in the supply chain and logistics industry. And it's a chance to share some insights and best practices on some of the challenges and different topics related to the supply chain. CEVA Talks are featured in CEVA Insights, which is CEVA Logistics Thought Leadership e-magazine that you'll be able to find online. Today, we're looking at what we can learn from the Trans-Pacific supply chain crisis. As we all know, the last couple of years have been pretty traumatic and fraught for anybody working out there on the Trans-Pacific. Since the beginning of the pandemic, there's been very little relief for shippers or BCOs, and for months now, we've been in a situation of terminal gridlock, record high freight rates, and service schedules that are barely worth the paper they're written on. And what used to be a largely predictable process of getting a container full of goods from, say, China through to the malls of the Midwest has now become a nightmare and absolute uncertainty. That much we all know. That the questions we want to attempt to answer today, however, are what can be done in the face of the market that we're living through. And to offer their insights on this, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Bjorn Vang Jensen and Tinglong Dai. Bjorn will be familiar to many of you, I think, as Vice President of Advisory Services at CEVA Intelligence, he's a well-renowned commentator on the state of the market. That commentary is based on many years of experience in shipping and logistics, with initially on the carrier side as far back as Maersk, 3PLs, TNT Logistics, for example, which is now CEVA, and as for 15 years as the Vice President of Logistics for Electrolux. Tinglong Dai is Professor of Operations Management and Business Analytics at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches operations management, artificial intelligence, and contracting. Tinglong's work has appeared in a large number of prestigious journals, with his most recent work being on the pandemic's impact on global supply chains and on COVID-19 vaccine rollouts. Again, welcome everyone. Please don't hesitate to react and to ask your questions in the chat section. We will endeavour to answer as many questions as possible at the end of this session. So I'd just like to start with where we are now. I'm going to turn to Bjorn first. Bjorn, I was reading the latest CEVA Intelligence Sunday Spotlight this week, and your colleague, Alan Murphy, is very adamant that supply chain congestion, port congestion is nowhere near over. Can you sort of elaborate on that a little bit and let us know where we are in terms of congestion, how it's impacting vessel schedules, and what this meaning for cargo delays?
Certainly, and thank you for having me, James, at CEVA. It's an honor. If we look at congestion, we have tended in the last 12 months to have this very myopic view, driven by dramatic imagery of queues and queues of vessels outside of the LA Long Beach complex in San Pedro Bay. It's very compelling imagery. I dare say it's a disaster, and it's not going away. Now, lately, the media have seized on the fact that there are fewer vessels queued outside the LA Long Beach. But the fact is, if you look at where those vessels have gone, and I refer to a study that came out by Analytica as late as yesterday, they haven't gone anywhere other than to other U.S. ports. So you see a chart that goes like this, and then they cross, and these are charts deployed into San Pedro Bay versus other American ports, and there's a near perfect split just in the last couple of weeks.
And a lot of them are still just slow steaming out across the Pacific as well.
Well, no, they purport to chart all the vessels that are also floating beyond the horizon. But the fact is that the congestion hasn't gone away; it's just moved, or some of it has moved elsewhere. That is not to say, by the way, that the congestion on the West Coast has gone away by any stretch of the imagination. There are still 50 to 60 vessels anchored off of Long Beach and waiting for berth. The average travel time for a container from Asia to Long Beach has increased from something like 25 days to 120 days, which is disastrous by any measure. Now, the shift of congestion or the shift of vessel capacity in the US has something to do with the fact that Oakland is slightly less congested if we stay on the West Coast. Vancouver can change every other day depending on the weather, and I'm not even joking. But also that a lot of these vessels have shifted to the East Coast for two reasons. Firstly, I'm just tired of having their vessels lying out there while they can offer somewhat better berthing times on the East Coast. And we're not talking about going back to the 40 days it used to be on a pendulum service to the East Coast, but we're still not talking about 120 days, and every day counts. Yeah. The other reason, of course, is that it's no secret that the ILWU's contract on the West Coast, the longshoremen, the unions, is up for renewal, and those war drums are already beating. And so a lot of carriers and customers are asking for alternative solutions via the East Coast. Yeah. Bottom line is the congestion in the US is not going anywhere. Exactly. That's number one. A very long number one, sorry. Number two is and this is why I said this myopic view on the US. Congestion is everywhere. It's booming in Asia. A lot of Asian ports are also seeing very long waiting times, both in China as well as in other larger ports in Asia, Hong Kong, and even Southeast Asia. If you chart congestion, it's going up and up and up and up. And it's also in Europe, as much as we like to think of ourselves as those people with automated terminals where everything just works like clockwork. It doesn't. And it doesn't largely because of trucker situations in Europe. It is probably the predominant factor. But that's where we are, and that's why it's not going away. Because to get rid of it, you have to first unclog the hinterland. You have to provide trucks. You have to provide storage for boxes. You have to provide storage for empty boxes. You have to provide railheads that actually work. And we're not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the problem does continue to seem to be intractable despite all the work that's supposedly being done on it. So
the notion that you can unclog a pipeline completely by removing one of three clogs is silly. It doesn't make the overall problem go away.
That actually goes straight into my next question, which is Tinglong. I mean, how does this? We look at it from the maritime point of view. We see what's happening in the ports and the container line schedules, things like that. What's happening in the wider supply chain when we get inland? And if you're a cargo owner or shipper trying to get your goods to market, what is this doing for transportation costs particularly? And what do these delays and congestion mean when you're when you are in the Midwest and a long way from these congested ports?
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I can provide a little bit perspective from the United States. I think, like you said, there's quite a bit of congestion causing by ocean freight. But then even when goods have been delivered here in the US, first of all, they got congested at the ports for many days. But when they have been unloaded, they have been put on the trucks, and so you have this urgency. You want to deliver them as soon as possible to warehouses, and then move them from warehouses and to the distribution centers and to the shelves. And surprisingly, you would think now with the shortage of truckers and the trucking capacity overall, United States, we should be using more of railway capacity, but it's actually the opposite is true, and for two reasons. One reason is because of COVID, and all the workers have got sick, and so you have this reduced capacity, and you have this weakened performance. And the second issue is that when the retailers and manufacturers are in a rush to deliver goods from point A to point B within the US, they tend to pick the faster option, faster, more flexible option. In this case, that would be trucking, to use trucks instead of use railways to transport the goods. And in fact, we have seen a reduced volume and of goods transported through trains versus through trucks. And then you look at the overall the trucking sector, and the capacity hasn't increased much. If anything, it has reduced because of COVID, and also because of overall tight labor market. So the way I look at it is, sure, this is a global supply chain problem, but we also have a really big problem here in the US. This is a domestic transportation problem that hasn't been solved. And if anything, has got worse over the past few years. And now if you try to increase the capacity, you have a variety of bottlenecks, right? First of all, you start with hiring. It's difficult to hire truck workers. And the second of all, it's difficult to buy new vehicles. And with semiconductor shortage, that's another global supply chain crisis, by the way. So,
vicious circle, isn't it?
yeah, so I agree with Bjorn, and that the problem is not going away in the short run. Just because to solve one problem would immediately expose you to another problem. And if you look at all the problem with the ports, with the LA and with Charleston, with Savannah, I think one bright spot is actually the port of Baltimore, and which President Biden actually toured last year. Only reason the port of Baltimore has been doing so well is because here we are specialized in automobiles. So Baltimore is the #1 importing and also exporting ports in terms of automobiles. With the global shortage of semiconductors, with Toyota, and even Toyota is expecting reduced production capacity. So so the port is going to be doing okay, and for a while, and because the amount of goods passing through the port is just so much smaller than before.
Yeah. You paint a picture there of really sort of reduced supply in terms of transportation services, but we also saw in the last 2 or 3 months of last year, we had record consumer spending. This huge amount of economic activity going on in the US market, particularly. Now, the basic laws of supply and demand, we all know where those go. Now, this should, I imagine, and well, I think it is, but you can probably tell the story better than I can. This must be pushing up prices when we get to the storefront, and we've had sort of, particularly in Europe, but also in the US, we've been seeing increased levels of inflation. Now, not all of that can be attributed to the supply chain, obviously, but to what extent do you think supply chain issues are related to growing inflation? I mean, to start with Tinglong, and then we come to you, Bjorn.
Yeah, so I think the question is, to what extent the supply chain is related to inflation? I think it's like a chicken and egg problem, right? You could also say that we have inflation in part because we have a supply chain problem, right? So the demand in the US is very high, right? Even as of January 2022, we still see 13% year-on-year increase in retail sales. 13%. That's already lower compared to last year. Well, last year we saw 20%. Also, now we're seeing 13%, but still very high. In part because we are printing trillions of dollars money, and people have to spend money somewhere. So the demand here is very strong, and so production capacity in China is very strong. And what the problem we have is that the pipeline connecting supply and demand isn't good enough, and they just have multiple bottlenecks. And also to the point, and Bjorn made in one of his op-eds, is that this is a long-term problem, but people do not see it that way. People think this is a short problem. People think there are easy fixes, and so mentality actually just makes it harder for people to fix such problems.
Yeah, Bjorn. I mean, this idea that supply chains in the past, they just were. Now people know they've had a rude awakening that supply chains exist and are actually a cost in their business. I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, let's start with the demand. Obviously, I agree, because it's impossible to disagree that that demand is up tremendously in the US, more so than anywhere else. Economic growth in the US is also higher. And you could make a quite solid case, as indeed we have in the past, that this entire problem started in the US because demand went through the roof. And I want to maybe build a little bit on what Tinglong is saying around why demand went through the roof. And I think you have three components. First of all, you have the effects of COVID in terms of the lockdown of services, right? So people simply couldn't, in many states, avail themselves of services. No restaurants, no bars, no haircuts, no massages on the more esoteric end, no tattoos, no nail appointments, no sports games, nothing to spend money on. And that money has a habit of flowing somewhere else, right? Because now that's burning a hole in people's pockets. Then comes the working from home situation, where people all of a sudden discover unmet needs in their home, legitimate unmet needs that they wouldn't have if they weren't working from home office equipment, home exercise equipment, etc., etc. And they fill that because they have money to fill that need, because they're not spending it on services. But that creates more strain in the supply chain, because now we're moving things, not services. Yeah. And then thirdly, if I may make just a third point, just to throw a ton of gasoline on that consumption fire, the government comes out and throws trillions of dollars in stimulus checks at the economy, which just puts more money in everyone's pockets. This is important. The stimulus checks didn't distinguish between whether you earned $1 million a year or you earned nothing. They're sort of to everybody, rather than direct the stimulus at those who really need it. Everybody got it, and that's why you have this growth in demand, which obviously relates to inflation. When the supply chain then clogs up, well, supply and demand kicks in, as you said, right?
Yeah. So if we've had, I mean, we're 2 years into this crisis now. We're almost, in many ways, coming out the other side. You only need one home office. You only need one Peloton. People are, slowly starting to go back to the office again, go back into services. So does that, and also we have the pressure of inflation on goods. Does that mean the system becomes self-limiting and we could start to see a retreat to lower demand coming off the back of this? And Bjorn first, and then Tinglong.
It almost passes straight to Tinglong because he's the expert here. I'm not an economist, right? But yes, it will eventually, over time. But this is not something that happens like this. Eventually, of course, things will normalize. A word I hate, but in any case, they will normalize or revert to the mean somewhere. But it not next month.
No.
Right.
No. What's your view on how long this will take to, what the demand thing will take to wind down, Tinglong, from your perspective?
This I can't answer. I need an economist for that one.
That's what I'm passing that one to Tinglong to see if he's got any sense of it.
Thank you. Well, we have seen the year-on-year retail growth. That growth rate has declined from 20% also to 13%. I think you talk to most people, they expect that number to decline to about 3% and 4%, probably 4% and 5% in the neighborhood of that this year. So I agree with Bjorn. Eventually, that number will go down, and eventually, prices are very, very high right now, and people have very few choices, and we're seeing the impacts of supply chain shortages. So eventually, with all the forces, and then also not to mention with reduction in the stimulus money, and so eventually, I think it will go down. And not to mention, this American way of life is not really sustainable, right? And actually, if anything, it got a lot worse during the COVID, right? People bought bigger houses, bigger cars, right? Now we look at 75% of cars is the US SUVs, and the people are buying giant houses, living in palaces, and then you have your own movie theater, your own gyms. and you have own weapons, right? Not to mention, and at a certain point, do you want to have our own police force? I don't know. So, so this is not sustainable. Eventually, the cost and will be too high, and eventually, people will at a certain point will stop spending with a run out of money, right? Because we have only so much resources.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. That's interesting. I guess sort of move slightly into wider picture now. I mean, given that we've had all of this disruption, it's been, one thing we've seen is, as I mentioned before, supply chain has gone from being something that's done at an executive level. It's now something that's talked about in the boardroom. It's become real for people who didn't know what a supply chain was 2 years ago. So I'm curious as to, what permanent changes there could be in the business in which we're working. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about shorter supply chains and getting rid of just-in-time, because just-in-time has proved to be very fragile. I mean, do we see any fundamental changes coming up? And I mean, let's start with you, Bjorn. What's your take on that?
You're going to see, whether it's a ship or whether you like it or not, you're going to see much more integration of logistics services into carriers. And no, it's not just Maersk. Everyone is pursuing it. And Maersk drove led the charge, but other people are very quickly following suit. And there will be lots of consolidation in the industry of the legal kind. And that will lead to much more bundled package services being offered. So that's one. Whether that will stick after everything normalizes, quote unquote, remains to be seen. Can these services actually stand alone as worthy products, or are they simply booming because customers have no choice but to go with them if they want this made? Now, the other thing that's going to be interesting, or is interesting, is right now, more and more shippers are talking about long-term contracts, which is something that the vast majority of shippers have shunned for years and years and years. I know when I was with my previous employer, every time I proposed them, I was shot down in flames. Now it's almost the price of entry. If you want to negotiate with a carrier, that you offer a long-term agreement. A long-term agreement are long-term agreements, which means, at least if they're relatively ironclad in terms of exiting, over the next, let's say, 3 years, you will see a lot of cargo locked in on long-term agreements. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's an excellent thing, because we'll get away from this, Turkish bazaar style of contracting shipping services, which will leave room for carriers to develop services. Those are big changes.
One question on that specifically that we've been throwing around in the office is, all right, we've seen, the very low rates offered back in 15, 16. We've seen the higher rates. Now, on either side of that equation, when it comes to contracts, they've often not been worth the paper they're written on. Now, if I sign up for a 10,000 per FEU contract now for the next 3 years, and things do ease back, and suddenly spot rates are down at 4,000 a TEU again. How strong are those contracts going to be?
Well, that's why I said that it depends on how ironclad those contracts really are in terms of exiting. And I've seen some examples that are pretty ironclad, and that's what it's going to take. Now, the smart way to do long-term contracting, and not all carriers are open to it, but some are, is, of course, to create a long-term contract that is linked to some sort of index.
Yeah, of course.
And I'm not going to sit here and recommend one index or the other. I have strong opinions on the various indexes, but I'll get in trouble both with the other ones and with all kinds of communities if I voice them here. But that is the way forward. Link it to some sort of index. And there are some very, very, very tricky elements to an index contract and to negotiating one that should not be taken lightly. But that is the way to do it. That is the way to get away from the I'm locked in for 10,000 and the market just went to 4 and my boss is now telling me to renegotiate or you'll find someone who can.
Yeah.
This has to go away.
Yeah.
And the index is the way forward there.
Yeah.
An alternative, if I just may, James, just quickly, is we're seeing the reemergence of a product called freight futures.
Yes.
Now, they are very misunderstood. They are not to be used in any way by logistics purchasing people. They are to be used by your treasury in order to hedge, and that's where that discussion belongs. But I would urge people to take a good look at it because it is a way to hedge your risk.
Yeah, no, it's something that's been. I know it's had sort of it's popped up at various times over the past years that I've been around, but it's
coming up at CPM in a big way, actually.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it'll be an interesting session at CPM. Find out what's happening with that. No, that'd be good. Just to step back into that wider picture again, though, in terms of there has been that sort of broad level discussion about this crisis is going to cause the end of globalization. It's going to cause the end of just-in-time ordering, just-in-time manufacturing. I mean, Tinglong, what's your outlook on that? I mean, will there be a fundamental change in the way of supply and manufacturing supply chains and things like that? Or is it just the simple fact that these long supply chains at the end of the day are always going to be the cheapest, most cost-effective way of doing it, and that this is just a crisis, it too shall pass, and then we'll this talk of unwinding globalization will quieten down again.
Thank you. And I think first of all, we get to that question about whether just-in-time JIT system will go away. I don't think so. I mean, if you give me a choice, I always prefer just-in-time than just-in-case, right? It's just we have already built this system, and it's not perfect, but it works very well for most part of the time. And plus, just-in-time is not a strategy. It is really an objective. You do everything you can, and you build a transparent supply chain. You try to build things together, try to coordinate and different parts of the supply chain to achieve this purpose. So it's not a strategy per se. It is really what you try to achieve. I don't think it's going away. The other way of looking at where just-in-time will go away is that most of the choices not actually up to us. It's actually up to a few very big retailers like Costco, or Walmart, and Amazon, and their collective choices actually will dominate and the supply chain practices. The way I look at it is that this is not just about a business problem. Eventually, they'll be pressured to reduce their carbon emissions, and they have to look at from the ESG perspective, environmental social governance perspective. When investors and also regulators dig deeper into their emission practice, they will say that, sure, you have a pretty good emission figures, but that's because you are relying on millions of third-party sellers, and you have a lot of emissions that are not even traceable. And so I think such pressure will lead to more efforts to build more transparent supply chains, and to a certain extent, maybe shorter supply chains. That we have not seen. We have not seen, by the way. But I think the pressure eventually will be there, and so Amazon is not going away, and with their emissions, and I think Walmart and Costco, other companies, they need to invest in their supply chain practice. I don't think just in case will be a replacement for just in time. If anything, I think it's going to be stronger, and we just need to figure out a smarter way to achieve that.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. When we were chatting just ahead of this, we talked about sort of how the supply chain was kind of no longer a chain, when we need to be talking about supply webs rather than supply chains. I mean, I want to throw it open to some questions in a sec, but if you just both give me a sort of like slight insight into what your understanding of a supply web is as opposed to a supply chain. Do you want to start first, Tinglong, and then we can go to Bjorn?
Well, first of all, I think supply chain as a term is an imperfect term, and even from very beginning, I think in the 90s, 20s, early this century, people try to find out, alternative to the term. At a certain point, people try to use value chain instead of supply chain, right? And people try to use demand supply chain, because it's not just supply, it's also about the demand. And people are never happy with this term, but for whatever reason, it just, it's just becoming really so successful. And so here we are. And so I think the idea to talk about supply web or supply networks is to recognize that this is not a linear configuration. And so this is fundamentally a network of different entities, and with the purpose of transforming raw materials to products that people are willing to pay for. And then, needless to say, and in today's world, and we have tons of data, we have so many different suppliers, so many different choices, and so consumers are changing their preferences every second. So the notion of supply chain that you have a supplier dedicated to a manufacturer who produce something, transport it to a warehouse and deliver to consumer house, that is no longer true. And instead, you're talking about for every layer supply chain, you have many choices. So the configuration just keep moving. And so I think in that sense, supply web or supply networks, it would be better description of what's actually going on in the real world.
Yeah, well, I think we've got two separate webinars that we could be doing on this with regarding carbon emissions and on the use of data, but we'll have to come back to this. Bjorn,
if I can add to the whole notion of the web, I mean, I'm a big proponent of the term supply web, and wherever I go and speak at conferences, I urge people to use the term web, and it resonates so well that in the days afterwards at conferences, people catch themselves saying, "Oh, I meant web. Sorry, supply web," because it really is right. This, as Tinglong has said, is not a new notion. I think I first came across the term in 1997, and it really resonated with me. And I want to. Network is a good phrase, but I would say to understand this, and there's no better framework than the current supply chain web mess to understand this. Imagine the spider web, right? You can be anywhere in that web, but let's say you're in the center. The point is that we've all been mean little children trying to tinker with a spider web. Some of us so mean that we try to figure out exactly which strand to cut to create the maximum effect. And the point is, there's always a strand to cut that creates effect, and that effect is immediate.
Yeah.
It's not something where you go, oops, that looks a little bit on the broken side. I should go and fix that like you can with a chain. This is like, whoa, an entire section of your supply chain just essentially imploded.
Yeah.
And I dare say that's what's happening now, right? Just think of that strand. All that strand that we've cut is the international bit, right? Yeah. The introduction of congestion in ports around the world. That's all it took, and the whole web is collapsing in on itself, right?
Well, it was only, initially it was only in the US that it's sort of cascaded out from there.
Sure. Yeah, well, you just made my point, right? Exactly. It was only in the US, but it was never only in the US. It was a web. US was that strand that needed to be cut, and the whole thing collapsed in on itself. It's a very useful visual for people to try and understand that there is no such thing as a supply chain unless you are a totally vertically integrated company like Henry Ford used to create back in 1918 or something. You will never have a supply chain. You will always have a web. And what you'll find is, as you start mapping your sub-suppliers, to your horror, you start realizing that those sub-suppliers are connected to other sub-suppliers. And you thought the two were separate, but they're not, because they deal with each other in a different context, maybe even for a different OEM. And so the whole thing has this it's almost a 3D. Okay, now it's almost a 3D web, right? Very, very, very difficult, but I would definitely urge people to think of the supply web in that term and stop the chain stuff.
I think it's a good analogy, and I think it's one that we should all probably be using more. Before we go down the rabbit hole of 3D webs, I'm going to we had a few questions coming through.
I'm going to copyright that right now, excuse me.
So I've got a few questions coming up on the screen here. So I'm just going to go through these one by one. We'll get through as many as we can in the next sort of five minutes or so. So first one is coming is, how can suppliers and logistics companies reduce the backlashes and effects of the pandemic? What are the alternative solutions for on-time shipments? Is there an alternative solution for on-time shipments? I guess that's just on-time shipments, perhaps.
You have two. You have nearshoring, which we've only sort of really scratched the surface of a little bit, and it's every time there's a crisis in the global supply chain, that word comes up. Some people it's like Tinglong was saying, whether it's a demand chain, the supply chain, the whatever chain, right? It's to say nearshoring, right shoring, inshoring, home shoring. The point is, we want to move our factory. We want to go back to the good old days where I had 65 factories and every single one of them was located very close to my RDC, and it manufactured only for this particular market, and life was terrific. And those days are never coming back. The reason why they're never coming back is it's a hugely uneconomical way to run a supply chain. It creates a massive inventory redundancy and overlap, and it exponentially increases your cost.
And I guess it's something, Tinglong, that you wouldn't really want to do based on the fact of a pandemic, because it's a very expensive investment that you then you're stuck with that huge change in what in the way you do things for a pandemic, which, God willing, is going to be over at some point in the near to medium term. So all right, well, let's go on to the next one. This might be another one for you, actually, Bjorn. What about waiting time in terminal and waiting time in the terminal? Okay, I think this is about D&D. Who's going to help the shippers recoup these?
That's a very good question, isn't it?
Why do we look at alternative markets? It's not
that's a minefield of a question, and an even larger minefield of a problem. If we level set ourselves here, the question really is, and demurrage, okay? So the payment of a container that has not left the port yet. We're not talking about detention, which is where you hold on to the box for your own reasons outside the port. We're talking about demurrage. And those costs can be high. They are pass-through costs. It's actually the port that levies those charges onto the carrier, and the carrier then passes them through to the importer. The question now, and I think it's a very pertinent question, especially in the US where the Federal Maritime Commission is involved, is why should I, as an importer, pay demurrage on a box when I'm standing there with a truck asking for my box?
Exactly. Yeah.
Maybe not quite, but that's the fundamental argument. Why am I'm standing at the truck, I want my box, you've buried it 6 levels deep in an offsite CY. Why should I pay demurrage for your inefficiencies? I don't have the answer. I can see both sides of the equation, right? Where the carrier's like, well, why should I pay? I didn't make the port inefficient. It's the terminal that should pay. The terminal says, well, why should I pay? You're the guys, sending ship after ship after ship after ship into my port and clogging up my facilities. It's a Gordian knot. I don't have the answer. Maybe the FMC does, but in my experience, if you really want to mess things up, government is a great way to start. But I don't have the answer. I don't have it. I can see it from all sides. I think it's good. You're going to probably the best answer was that everybody pays 1/3. I mean, look, the point. But you do whoever, listen, if you're an importer, whoever pays that bill, whether you pay directly or not, the money is going to be there somewhere in the rate. It just means you're going to be paying higher rates, right? It's a zero-sum game.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Okay, one for Tinglong now. The supply and demand is increasing, but access to raw materials and fast operations have not improved. Which steps might companies follow to avoid delayed orders and shipments? It's a pretty tricky one.
Okay. I need to take a little absolute question. So which steps might companies follow to delayed orders shipments? Well, I think first of all, this is really about how much consumers are willing to wait. And for example, in the US, and there has been huge housing market boom, right? You look at housing prices increased by double digits. In certain markets, of almost 40% increase in housing prices. So there is a strong demand there. So people, with the increase in demand for old houses, people also building new houses. But then you see the increase in prices in raw materials and operations. People build a house, but they don't have the door, right? Or they have a door, they don't have the other parts and needed for the entire house. Yeah. So I think, this is where the traditional supply chain strategies can still turn out to be useful. And to think about ways to reduce demand uncertainty. Ways, for example, think about strategically postpone different steps of the manufacturing or the marketing, and or use pre-booking, and basically do whatever you can to have a better understanding of demand, and also try to smooth out that demand a little bit. So this is where I don't think we have a good answers to that. But on the other hand, I think the conventional wisdom in supply chain management can still prove useful.
Okay, cool. All right. Listen, there are more questions I'd love to go through. I think I understand that these are coming through on LinkedIn, and I think Bjorn and Tinglong are going to be able to come back and answer some of these on LinkedIn after we finish this event. So thank you for the questions. Keep asking them. We'll try and get back to as many of those as possible. It's almost time to wrap up. So, gentlemen, I'm going to give you your minute of fame. You don't get 15 minutes anymore. Can you just, I don't know, give me your key takeaway. What is it that's going to get us out of that? What can we learn from where we are now? And Bjorn, you go first, and then we can take along.
We've built a chart in Sea Intelligence that sort of tries to list all the things that need to go right in order for this to go back to normal. There are about 9 steps, and I can't go through them all because they're involved. The bottom line is that those steps are all, or some of them anyway, are not sequential, they're cumulative. They can only run in a straight line. Yeah. So we worked out that it's going to take, if all of these things go right, probably a year and a half before this thing comes anywhere near back to normal. That's presupposing no cyber attacks that are going to cripple the industry as we're potentially facing right now. No labor action on the West Coast. No labor action on the East Coast, because their contract is up next year. And all kinds of other stuff. It's very difficult for me to see how this is going to go away in the next 2 years.
And I guess the other black swan is the original black swan, as there's no further massive outbreak of COVID in China, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
A new variant that takes us back to.
Look, we're in logistics here. There's no such thing as a normal day in this job, and we've all chosen it, many of us, because we love that. I do, certainly. I think a lot of us do, right? Yeah. Well, I guess we're going to have our 2 years of fame, not 1 minute. And the only thing I'm going to urge people to do is spread the risk, flatten the curve if you can, as Tinglong is saying, or at least take some of the variations out of it. Make use of index contracts, sign long-term agreements, consider locking the carriers into logistics services as well, incentivize them, because it is going to be their playing field for the next 2 years.
Brilliant.
Bad news, sorry, but it is what it is.
Tinglong, can you add anything further? Perhaps a slightly more optimistic note, or you can go out with this.
Sorry about that. I don't think I can deliver on this side, but I do think from the government's and the business side, what's happening right now is perfectly predictable. And look, we have been ignoring infrastructure. You go to travel to the US, if you get a chance to come to the US, you see how terrible our highways are. We have the worst railway system you can ever find. And it's big, it's very expensive, but it's just terrible. And it's so slow, it's very dangerous, and it's not reliable at all. And worst railway system you can ever imagine. We have terrible airports. And we have been ignoring investments in infrastructure for years, and now we are wondering why this is happening to us, right? And not to mention, you also think about the whole American way of life is just not sustainable based on what we have. And we have been ignoring infrastructure, ignoring manufacturing and engineering, and US universities are producing too many business graduates, which is good for me, but bad for the country. And we don't have enough engineering graduates. We don't have enough talents. So I hope this pandemic really can get people to rethink the way we do things. There's something fundamentally wrong with infrastructure we have, with the way of life we've got used to, and if anything, just we have been doubling down during the pandemic. So that's what I hope. I don't think it's going to change, but I still have this really naive hope that something.
I think naive hope is the best way we can come out of this. Gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure. Unfortunately, we've hit our time now. It's been great speaking to you both. I'd like to thank you both, Bjorn and Tinglong, for taking the time this afternoon. And also I'd like to thank CEVA Logistics for giving us all the opportunity to speak here. And I'd like to thank you who've been sitting in on this, listening, watching, whatever, wherever you are. Thank you so very much for your time. We do hope it's been of use, and keep an eye out for the next CEVA Insights Outlook. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.